One of the most essential things you will need in Dungeons & Dragons is a character. A character is going to be the main protagonist that you follow throughout your adventure. Either they will be a hero or a villain, doesn't really matter. Point is, you're going to need one. So, your character will be affected by all different types of things. Their race, their class, their background, and personal ties, that kind of thing. So creating a character is pretty easy, really. You're only going to need a couple things. You have these wonderful character sheets that you can find online. Just search up Dungeons & Dragons character sheet and you can find them pretty easy. You will need some dice to roll with, and you will need a pencil. For specifics, these dice are called 1d6. They are 6-sided with numbers 1 through 6. So those are all the materials you will need. With that, I'm going to jump into kind of explaining some of the races that you can find in Dungeons & Dragons, and we will go from there. Dungeons & Dragons is a role-playing game, or an RPG. What that means is that you basically are your character. What your character does is what you do. You will be dictating your character's actions. So when you create your character, keep this in mind, as you're going to kind of want to figure out what your character would do in a certain situation. Because your character will have flaws, they will have personality traits, they'll have all kinds of different things that will make them do different things in certain scenarios. We will talk about this a little bit later on, but it's just something to keep in mind for now. So the first thing that I always do when I create a character is I choose their race. The race is kind of important because it will determine what your character will be good at, let's say job-wise. Because you will eventually have classes, and your class can be affected by what race your character is. So I'm going to go ahead and go through some of the most basic races and boil them down. So there are 4 main races in Dungeons & Dragons. There are your humans, your elves, your dwarves, and your halflings. There are a couple more races, but these are more unique and can be kind of hard to play with, so I'm just going to go through the basic ones for now. Start with dwarves. Dwarves are basically short, sturdy, human-looking creatures. Most of them live in mines, and they are part of these things called guilds. Guilds are basically their family members and where they live in. So dwarves live for an extremely long time. They live up to 400 years old, and they will probably live, they're the second longest living race in Dungeons & Dragons. Now, many of them are master weaponsmiths, craftsmiths, stuff like that. They love mining for wealth. While they are not exactly greedy, they do like the stuff that they have. If you're looking for a short, sturdy character that can tank damage, the dwarf is probably for you. Elves. Elves and dwarves are kind of rivals of sorts, depending on what kind of world you play in, but keep in mind that there may be conflict if you have elf and dwarven characters. Now, most isolate themselves in basically these forest villages away from other civilizations. They don't interact too much with, say, humans or dwarves. They're kind of in their own different part of the world. Most live in tune with nature. They love nature, and they like to write works of art. They like to write poetry. They do all that kind of fun stuff. They love music and that kind of thing. Most are lawful good. They don't exactly perform works of evil. But there are different kinds of elves called the Drow. Drow are basically evil elves, and nobody really likes evil elves. They are completely outcast from society, and most don't get along well with pretty much anybody. So elves are tall, they're fast, they're very nimble. So if you have, say, a rogue, rogues usually make a good choice for elf races. You can also do stuff like warlocks and wizards or druids, because elves are actually really good with magic because they have really high intelligence scores. So elves are mostly based for support or assassin type roles, and that's the kind of character you'd be looking for if you wanted to choose an elf. Halflings are basically really short humans. Remember the dwarves I talked about earlier? Yeah, they're them, except shorter. So halflings, they live in hillsides usually. They're mostly farmers and stuff like that. Most of them don't adventure. They usually find that they love things at home. They love the food. They love the drink. They love that kind of thing. They don't really like to go out and adventure. The ones that do usually become things like merchants or any other type of traveling profession. Sometimes they're musical performers and stuff like that. The ones that do go on adventures, though, usually make good stealth classes because they have the ability to blend easily into other societies. Most people see a halfling and they don't really suspect them because they're small and they're not very intimidating. So again, assassin classes very good for halflings. They also make decent fighter classes if you know how to make them correctly, because some halflings are actually very sturdy and are hard to kill. So halflings are a little bit maneuverable, but not quite as maneuverable as the next race I'm going to talk about, the humans. Humans are, well, basically me. It's about as generic as you can get. I'm a pretty generic guy. So humans, while they kind of have a little bit of skills here and there, they're not exactly skilled in one thing or the other. you'll find that they're a very well-rounded race. You can do almost anything with a human that you could do with almost any other race. The main downside to them is that they have very, very short lifespans compared to everybody else. Elves live for over 1,000 years. Dwarves can live up to 400 years. Humans, as we probably all know, can only live up to about maybe 100 years max. So if you're looking for something well-rounded, a human is definitely the way to go, but there are definitely other options if you're looking to specialize one way or the other. Okay, so that does it for all the generic races. Now, there are other races involved in the world of Dungeons & Dragons. There's gnomes, orcs, tieflings, dragonborns, all kinds of things. Some of them are homebrew, which means they were made by a couple of people sitting at a table who just wanted to add something to the game. Others are part of the standard game, but are just rarer to find and are harder to play with. If you want to research these races, I will put a link kind of right up here for you, and you can go check that out for yourself. Okay, so now that you have selected a race, you're going to want to fill a couple of things out on this sheet that I have printed out right here. So, as I said earlier, these are the basic character creation sheets. You can pretty much Google these and find these for free anywhere on the internet, and then just print them out later. You can even fill them out on the internet if you'd like. There are ways you can turn them into PDFs and that kind of thing if you're into that. So, once you've selected a race, there's only a couple things that you need to fill out for now. So a couple of things that you need to fill out. The first one is you're going to want to put, well, what race your character is. So right here I have put elf, and I'm going to make my character an elf. Each race has a specific moving speed that'll be kind of set out in the guidelines of the, you can just look that up, and several sources will tell you exactly what it is. For an elf, it's about 30 feet. This is very useful in moving and dungeon crawling and that kind of thing. I'm going to move this paper up just a little bit. Down here we have proficiencies and languages. So each race will be proficient in different things. They will be able to speak different languages. So for the elf that I'm playing, I'll actually be playing a type of elf called a high elf. They have a perception proficiency. Now that just means that basically I'll have this proficiency bonus up here. Whenever I do something that involves perception, I will be able to use that proficiency bonus and sometimes even double it in order to basically get a very good roll. I also have a couple of other things. I'm able to speak Elven, and I'm able to speak Dwarven. And I'm also proficient with certain kinds of weapons, so I could put down here finesse weapons. Alright. So I also have over here features and traits. So right here we have our features and traits. Since I'm an elf, I have dark vision. This is because elves live in forests and it gets very, very dark, and they're just able to see pretty well. So that's where that will be right there. We also will have Fey Ancestry. For those who don't know, Fey is another way of saying elf. That will basically make me immune to certain kinds of charms. And Trance. I can basically perform a special rest that doesn't take as long and does the same thing as a normal rest. A couple other things you're going to want to fill in. I have the second half of the character sheet right here. You are going to want to fill in your age. I just threw some oblong numbers on here. Keep in mind that if you make your character too young or too old, they will have certain debuffs due to their age. 90. So I just threw a 97 on here. Weight and height are the same exact thing. There are some guidelines in the handbook that each race has that kind of will work out best for that race. If you make them too tall or too short or that kind of thing, you may have some issues because you may get some debuffs for that. So I just threw 5 feet on there, 120 pounds, and then for description, I gave him some brown eyes, fair skin, and brown hair. Now there's also this character appearance right here. If you would like, you could draw that now. You could wait until you pick your class in order to draw that, but that's just kind of a descriptive detail that's nice to have. You don't really need to fill it in right now. Now that we've chosen a race, we can move on to choosing a class. Now, a class is like a job of sorts. Each class has special perks and special equipment. It will determine what kind of attacks you can use and how you're going to use them. Some people use melee weapons, others use spells, and that kind of thing. So, classes vary all over the place. You could have a warlock, who's basically a spellcasting wizard, or you could have a barbarian, who's basically a rage fighter. Your race can determine exactly what you choose for this section. So you might want to look back at your race and see what buffs they give you as I'm going through the classes. So with that, we're going to jump right into classes. Alright, so we're going to start off with barbarians. Barbarians are a pretty basic class, which is why I'm going to start with them. So they're kind of rage fighters, that's exactly what they are, What they do is they channel their rage into different abilities that gives them more strength and allows them to fight better, pretty much. They can buff their weapons, they can buff their defense, stuff like that. Most barbarians live out in the wild. They are kind of these wild men and women who run around doing all kinds of crazy things. Now, some choose to use their rage to fight, like directly from their rage. Basically, let's say you fail a test, you're very, very angry about it. Well, that's what they do. They get very mad at stuff and they beat it. Then there's the other side who is more attuned with nature. These barbarians, they come from distant lands. They may have a forgotten home, but they're in tune with nature and they'll use beasts and that kind of thing to complete their tasks. All right, so next we're going to talk about bards. I'm going to talk about bards right after barbarians because they're basically the complete opposite end of the playing field. Now, bards are almost like a support class of sorts. A lot of them use magic, usually singing it in order to do it, to heal allies, buff their allies, and basically help their allies out in battle. Now, a lot of them are trained in musical arts. In fact, that's what they do most of the time. They're like that one annoying friend who never stops singing. They will carry guitars, flutes, and that kind of thing into battle and use it to play music. In Dungeons and Dragons, music is not the type of music we think about here. Music can be lethal. So think about that for a minute. If you want to be the annoying support class who runs around singing songs, buffing your allies, and basically being an annoyance for all of your enemies, this guy might just be for you. Clerics. So I want you to get a mental image in your head real fast. Imagine the Pope. Now imagine he's a little bit younger. Now imagine that he has the ability to hold a battle axe in both hands. That's basically a cleric. They are like priests that run around defending their shrines, defending the honor of their gods, and that kind of thing. If you think about a crusader, pretty similar. So basically what they do is they run around and they usually are devoted to one deity or god in Dungeons and Dragons. There are a lot of different deities in Dungeons and Dragons, which makes this a pretty complicated class because your entire character can change based off of which deity they follow. It could be a good deity, an evil deity, all that kind of stuff. Now, clerics are kind of a mix of a wizard and a fighter. Usually they know how to perform magic. It can be healing magic, it could be damage magic, and is usually granted to them through their deity. Yet they also have the ability to use melee weapons. They use hammers, flails, cat o' nine tails, all kinds of damaging stuff. So basically, they're holy warriors. Since things can get a little complicated based off the whole, deity thing, I'm going to leave a link right up here so that you can kind of click on that and make sure that you choose the deity that you would rather follow, because that can change your entire gameplay experience. But yeah, priests, they like to kill stuff. Druids are basically nature wizards. So they live almost on their own usually, or in small brotherhoods in nature. They live in forests, they will live out in the desert. Basically, they pick an environment and they protect it. They have a very strong belief that one element cannot be stronger than the other. Now, druids are a little special in their fighting style. Most of them use very, very advanced magic that has something to do with nature, and they use nature as their catalyst almost for their spells. So, if they live in the desert, they may have an ability to let them summon a sandstorm or something along that line. Now, they also, just because they use magic does not mean they can not use melee weapons. They do have the ability to use melee weapons, but their one limitation is that they usually cannot be made out of metal because, I don't know, bad mojo or something like that. So basically, they're tree huggers, except a little fanatical. So stay away from their forests, and yeah, that's a druid. Monks are next on our list. These guys are basically clerics, except they don't really use weapons too much. They mostly use these things called their fists, and it's really kind of cool because they channel this thing called ki. Now, ki is like chi, except Dungeons and Dragons edition, basically. Think of it as kung fu magic, because that's pretty much what it is. They're usually at a very young age are dedicated to an order. They will train pretty much their entire life in an order of monks, and they have very, very little interaction with the outside world. So if you're going to pick this class, your character will probably have some difficulty interacting with people. That's a trait that most monks have. But the upside to that is that they are very powerful and they are very good at what they do. They are literally able to catch projectiles out of midair and pummel stuff to death with their fists. So basically, they're Jackie Chan. Okay, so the second to last class that we're going to talk about is the Ranger. Now, Rangers are basically these, let's call them Boy Scouts of sorts, that live in the wilderness. That is where they spend most of their time. They live out in the wild,
and they kind of dedicate themselves to hunting one kind of evil, be it orcs, dragons, undead, skeletons, or any other type of evil monster. Most of them are lawful good in the sense that they choose a village to protect or a local area and they protect that area, and they are absolute masters of the environment that they live in. So if they live in the woods, they know the woods really well. If they live in the desert, they know the desert pretty well. These guys are really, really trained in the weapon of their choice, be it a sword, an axe, a longbow, that kind of thing. So these guys, they are not exactly upfront fighters all the time. They tend to use their knowledge of the wilderness to ambush opponents, and they really know kind of how to fight the monsters that you will encounter in your campaign. A lot of people use rangers because they're beginner friendly, mostly because they know one type of monster really well and can fight that monster really easily. So if you're looking for a beginner friendly class that's kind of well rounded in the sense that they know magic, they can upfront fight, and they can attack from the sidelines, the ranger class is probably for you. Alright, so the last class that I'm going to talk about is the rogue. Now, rogues are basically these very, very sneaky, shady people that if you ever saw them in a public place, they're the type of people that you just wouldn't want to talk to. Most of them are assassins, thieves, lockpicks, and they don't exactly live honest lives most of the time. Now, that's not to say that most rogues are evil, but they have a tendency to be evil. A lot of them, they work mostly for themselves. They are dedicated to a crime guild, maybe, and that is their main source of income, is they do different kinds of crimes. They may rob, they may assassinate people for money. Rogues are not exactly upfront fighters. Most of them tend to rely on the ability to stealth their opponent, so they typically wait for an opening and then ambush, or something along that line. Most of them prefer not to get up close and personal, but they are skilled in the melee weapons that they use. Most use daggers, knives, short bows, that kind of thing. So if you're looking for a stealth fighter, you should probably choose the rogue class. Alright, so that is all the classes that I'm going to talk about for now. There are a handful of others out there. There are 3 different types of spellcasters that are the 3 main ones that I didn't talk about. They are wizards, sorcerers, and warlocks respectively. I will kind of leave a link somewhere over here for you guys to click on so you can research those for yourselves. Okay, so now that we have kind of chosen our race and class, what we're going to do is we are going to roll for scores, or abilities rather. Abilities will help us throughout the game, and these are going to be something very, very important. So I'm going to grab these 1d6s here. They are called 1d6s because they have 6 sides, so or rather 4d6 rather. So they have 6 sides, numbers 1 through 6. Throughout your campaign, you'll hear stuff like roll a 1d8. That means roll a die with 8 sides. And that's kind of what you're going to be looking for there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this dice and I'm going to roll it. So I'm going to take our dice and roll here really fast. And then I'm going to kind of put them into view for you there. So as you can see, we have a 3, a 1, a 2, and a 6. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the smallest one out. This is kind of how we're rolling for our abilities. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the number 1 out, and I'm going to put it just over to the side over here. We're not going to count it when we add up, so I'm going to add the 6 and the 3 and the 2 together. I took the 1 out because it's the lowest number, so then I would just add the 6, the 3, and the 2 because they are not the lowest number. So 6, 3, 2, that is 11. So I'm going to take a pen, I'm going to write that down on a piece of paper just real fast. Alright, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the die and do this one more time. I'm actually going to do it for a total of 6 times since we have 6 abilities. So I'm going to take the dice. I'm going to roll them again. Alright, so then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the lowest scores and I'm going to remove the lowest one. And I'm going to add these numbers up again. So I have a 3, and a 1. That is 7. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this a couple more times, 6 in total. Okay, so now that we have rolled our dice, I have right here a list of numbers. Those numbers are 11, 7, 10, 16, 10, and 14. So I got lucky and I rolled just a little high. So what we can do now is we're going to move into this little area right here. These are all your different skills. so I'm going to run through these real fast. Strength is basically just how strong your character is. If they use melee weapons, it may affect how they use their melee weapons, and it might determine stuff like how far they can climb and that kind of thing. Dexterity is how fast your character can move and how nimble they are. Constitution is how sturdy and healthy your character is, so they might be more resistant to poison and they might be able to take more damage. Intelligence is, well, kind of how intelligent your character is. It is important to differentiate between intelligence and wisdom. Intelligence is used for more history and certain types of spell casting, while wisdom is used for stuff like medicine and survival, and can also be used for spell casting depending on what type of character that you play. Charisma is how likable your character is. It can help you persuade people and stuff along that line. So now that we have our numbers, our 11, 7, 10, 16, 10, 14, what we need to do is we need to look at our class and determine what we want to do. So since I'm playing a druid, druids cast lots of spells, and they primarily cast off of their intelligence and their wisdom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give my highest score to my intelligence. So that is a 16. Now, I'm not just going to write a 16 directly into the slot, because I also, since I am a elf, a high elf to be specific, I get a boost to my intelligence, and that is a +1. So I will take that 16 and add a 1 to it, which is an overall score of 17. Next, move on to wisdom. I'm just going to throw the 14 in there, because wisdom is also important for a druid. I'm going to throw my 11 into my charisma. I'm going to throw my 10 into my constitution. I will throw my 12 into my dexterity. And my 7 into strength. And for those of you wondering how I got a 12, that's because, again, I'm an elf. I have a buff to my dexterity. Alright, so now we have filled in our skill levels. So our skill levels kind of just tell us exactly how good we are at a certain skill. What does not tell us is how our skill will affect our dice rolls. This is left up to the skill modifier. That's the big number here that is above the number that you just put in. So, for example, my strength is a 7, which is really, really low. So I'll actually have a debuff of -2 on my modifier. Now, what this means exactly and how you figure this out is there's a scale. This scale is really easy to find. Just kind of Google D&D modifier scale and it will show up almost anywhere, and it's very, very easy to find. So I will look it up. I realize that my 7 is in the range where I get a -2 debuff, and I put that in. Same thing down here, for example, my intelligence score is really, really high, so I get a 17, and that gives me a score of +3. Now, what this means is, say I roll a dice to determine, let's say, if I cast a spell. My spell will rely on my intelligence score. So maybe I need to see if my attack will hit or not. Well, whatever I roll, I get a +3 added onto that, since my intelligence modifier is +3. Now, there are also, over here, some skills and stuff like that. These are called saving throws. Saving throws determine if you fail or pass a skill. It might determine if you get hit by an attack. So you'll fill these in, and you are proficient at 2 of them. Your class will tell you which 2 you are proficient at. So in my case, I have intelligence here. I have bubbled that in. I'm proficient at it. And I have wisdom. I'm proficient at that. What proficient means is, as you level up, you'll get something called a proficiency bonus. This is basically a numerical bonus that tags on to your additional rolls already. So since I'm a level 1 character, in fact, I'm going to put that right over here. I am a level 1 druid. I get a proficiency bonus to start with of +2. So what that means is anything I am proficient in, not only do I get my modifier that I already have, but I add 2 onto that. So like down here, we have these things called skills. These are different types of skills that you can use. It is medicine skill, investigation skill, all that kind of stuff. Basically, almost any activity that you might need to do, you have a skill down here for it. Since I am a druid, I got to choose 2 of these proficiencies, and when you look up your class, it will probably tell you what you are limited to in terms of skill. So like I chose, for my druid, I chose Arcana, which is a type of magic, and I chose medicine. So I have a +2 modifier already from my wisdom score. As you can see right here, it says wisdom. So I add my skill modifier to that, but since I'm proficient in it, I also get another +2 bonus whenever I need to roll for medicine. Same thing with religion. Religion is an intelligence score, so since I have an intelligence modifier of +3, I also am proficient in it, so I get a +2 bonus. So another thing that I just want to talk about real fast is the background. The background is something I will not go over too much in depth just because there are so many of them. A lot of people make them at home by themselves. Others are in the Dungeons & Dragons handbook, and you can look them up. I chose one out of the handbook. It's called the Sage. A Sage is like a scholar of sorts. So what the Sage does is it gave me 3 additional skill proficiencies. So I chose, I believe, Perception, History, and Religion. And then it also gave me 2 additional languages. And for those languages, I'd also have chosen to be proficient in Halfling. And I have chosen to be fluent in Orc. I also, since I am a druid, I know a special language called Druidic. And that is, for now, most of the modifiers and scores. Now we're going to move on to features, traits, and that kind of thing. Alright, so now we're going to move into a couple more of the class-based features of this character sheet. So, starting off, we're going to start off with a little bit of our gear. Now, characters get a certain gear based off of their class and their background. So, for example, in the Druid class, basically, for beginner characters, you should look at the handbook. You'll get a list of starting items that you can choose between. So, for my weapon, for example, I had a choice between choosing a scimitar or any other simple weapon. I chose the scimitar, and so I'll put that here in the attacks and spellcasting area. Scimitar, 1d6 plus 1 of slashing damage. The damage type is important to write down because depending on the enemy that you fight, if they have a certain armor, they may be more immune to slashing attacks, meaning you get a debuff. Alright, so continuing on with equipment, down here in the little equipment box, there are some other things that I get to choose between. So since I'm a druid, again, I've chosen a wooden shield. I also get to choose between a different type of armor type. Again, because I'm the druid class. So since I am proficient in light armor, which I'll go over proficiencies later, I will choose the leather armor class. I also get a couple other bits of starting equipment. I get a backpack, a druid focus, and a bedroll. All these things are kind of flavor items except for the druid focus. They're things that your character will have, and it might improve a bit of their ability to, say, sleep or carry items. So I also have my background. I have the Sage background up here. Now, because of that background, I also get a few more starting items. I'm going to fill those in kind of off screen because they're mostly flavor items. I'll get stuff like ink, a mess kit, a water skin, a torch, and these things all have weight. Now, weight I wouldn't worry about too much. I would let your DM worry about that kind of thing, but basically be aware that you can overburden your character with stuff later on in the game. Okay, so kind of the last thing we're going to do related to classes here is we are going to talk about some of the other proficiencies that they have. Now, every single class has a proficiency in different fields. So, since I am a druid, I have lots of proficiencies. So, I'm going to try and squeeze them into this box right here. I kind of wrote big because I was trying to have the camera pick it all up. But, for example, I have armor proficiencies, weapon proficiencies, tool proficiencies. I have all different types. So I already kind of wrote in the languages here. I wrote that I have I can speak Elven, Dwarven, Halfling, Orc, and Druid, and those are all different proficiencies. I am proficient in speaking those languages, you could say. But then I also have armor proficiencies. So, for example, I have light armor. So armor-wise, I could just write armor and then list the types. So since I'm a druid, light and heavy benefit me. If I try using something that I'm not proficient in, I will actually get a debuff. And the debuff kind of depends on what class you are and what weapon you are using. So I'm going to write below this box, just I'm running out of room. I'm going to write the different weapons I am proficient in. I have a very, very long list of weapons that I'm proficient in due to my different backgrounds. So I'm just going to write a couple basic ones like club, short bow, and the short sword, and then I'm just going to put a dot down here. Now, if you need to, you can, of course, use the back of your sheet. If you have a long list of proficiencies that you cannot fit into the box, you can always write on the back, and that will be absolutely fine. So now that we are done with talking about gear and proficiencies, we're going to move on and talk about kind of this upper area up here. So we already talked about speed earlier, and that is determined by your race. Now this can be affected also by the type of armor that you're using, or the weapon that you're using, and your character's weight. So just keep those factors in mind. So, for example, if I were a druid, an elf, and I weighed very, very light, and I used a really heavy armor class, I would probably get a debuff to my speed. If I had too much gear, I will get a debuff to my speed. So, with that, we're going to talk about armor class. Armor class is determined by what type of armor you're wearing and what shield you are wearing. This is all determined, most characters start off with a base of 10, and then they add on their armor and their shield. So since I'm a druid, I have an armor class of 14, and basically that determines what hits me and damages me, and what does not. Next is initiative. This is used to determine who goes first in combat. You will have things called combat phases. Basically, your initiative score is just going to be your dexterity modifier. Since I have a +1 here, I'll take that +1, move it right here. Next, there are my current hit points. Since I am a level 1 character, all level 1 characters will usually start off with a 1d8. So that's basically a one die with 8 sides. So I will come over here, and I will put 1d8. Don't worry about temporary hit points. Temporary hit points are just different modifiers you can get in the game. Now, the number of hit dice that I have is also a 1d8. This is my total health in general. Okay, so one of the last things that I'm going to talk about for just the class-wise and what you have to fill in for your class is going to be spells. So there are these different things called spells and cantrips. They're all magical abilities that you can use in Dungeons & Dragons. So your class will tell you what spells and cantrips you will use. I'm not going to write down any specific ones, but basically over here on the features and traits section, your class will tell you exactly what you use to cast these spells. So, for example, I am a druid, which means that when I cast a spell, I use my intelligence. So what I would do is I will take my character. When I choose my cantrip is an intelligence ability. So over here in features and traits, I will say I know one cantrip. I'm not going to say what one it is because I'm not going to get into specifics. And then I'm going to put in parentheses intelligence, and that basically tells me that when I cast this cantrip that I know, I am able to cast it using my intelligence modifier and score. I am also able to cast different spells. My spell casting ability is actually based off of my wisdom, so I will also put over here in features and traits spell casting, and then in parentheses wisdom. So when you do eventually pick out your different spells, that will actually go over here into attacks and spellcasting. You will list out exactly what you want to do. So just as an example, let's say I have a spell that lets me use a small flame. So what I will do is I will come over here into my spellcasting, and I will I will write, flame, followed by its duration, how long it lasts. So let's say it lasts 10 minutes. And if I were to attack using it, it would use a 1d8 for damage. Okay, so the last thing on this front page that you're going to want to fill out is your character's different personalities. So your character will have personality traits. So since I'm a druid and I'm a sage, perhaps my personality trait is that I'm used to, say, helping out people who aren't very smart, and that I'm a very beneficial sage druid, and I teach people about nature. That's something I could write in there. There's also ideals. Ideals are kind of what your character believes in, what they'll be able to do. So say, since I'm a sage, I'm really addicted to knowledge. I could believe that knowledge is power and would do almost anything to attain knowledge. Bonds are any bonds that your character has. So let's say that your character has a special bond to a brother or a sister, or maybe they're like dedicated to an order or their students. You can write that down there. Then there's also flaws. Every character should have flaws. A very common mistake that people do when they make a character is they want their character to be this all-powerful god with no emotions and basically no flaws whatsoever. That will result in a very, very boring game. It's good to have your character have flaws. Character flaws are very important. Okay, so kind of the last thing I'm going to talk about the character sheet is this back page. So we've already looked at it kind of once. This is where we filled out our character's appearance. So back here is mostly just flavor. We have the additional features and traits section, so if you can speak more languages and if you have certain spells that you have, you can put these all back here. This is your character appearance. As you can see, I am not exactly the artist. I have drawn my wild druid with his long hair and creepy scholar smile. So that is your, you can draw that in if you want, and you're not a good artist. You could always take some images offline and put that there. Right down here, you have the character backstory section, and that is this entire bottom column down here. Now, it is very important that you give your character some kind of background. If they're going on a quest, there's usually a reason they're going on that quest. That's where you would put this. So since I'm a scholar, say I was exiled from a druid clan, and that I am trying to regain my honor by saving a certain part of a forest that has been contaminated. That could be my entire character backstory. That could be the entire reason that I'm there. This is also a good place to look for your flaws. If you're looking for information for the front page, you can use your background to create that. Down at the very, very bottom here, we have treasure. So this is just items that your character finds throughout their adventure. You can all put that down there, and it will let you, this is where you can put additional gear as well, like potions and that kind of thing. And the very, very last thing is your allies and organizations. As you rank up in Dungeons & Dragons, your class may get associated with a certain order of sorts. So like, for example, my druid character could get drawn into a certain order of a certain element, and he can get special abilities based off of that. And so I can give you my faction rank, and that will tell me what kind of spells I can cast. And I can also draw in a little faction emblem right here if I want. So that is pretty much it to the character sheet. We have our front and back page. The front is mostly your stats, your gear, where you write in all your numbers, your proficiencies, and you'll write in some of your features and character traits. The back is almost all flavor. It is for your character image. Their backs is for their character image, their backstory, treasure, traits, and organization. And that is the essentials to a character sheet. I will leave links at the bottom of this video so that you can take a look for yourself at your own sources, but that is really the basics.